Well, it's time to review this week's episode of Samurai Jack Season 5, and before we get started, I'll have to explain how this analysis, when compared to last week's, will most likely be much shorter and not capture as much detail. The reason for this isn't because I'm being slowed down by recent events, it's more that it has to do with how this episode is much more straightforward by comparison to the premiere. One thing I have to say, though, is that I'm very disappointed that this season does not have an awesome intro like previous seasons, and it's pretty much just Jack reciting his story that we got last week. It's shameful because I'm pretty sure that I remember hearing somewhere that we were going to get an updated opening with visuals representing events of this season, but I guess we're not getting that. Maybe they wanted to avoid spoilers, but the advertisements have done that already, so that's literally no excuse. This episode begins with a focus on Aku as we see his much more down-to-earth side, as opposed to the barbaric overlord who overtook the Earth. What people always loved about Aku as a villain is that he was clearly a menace. He's powerful enough to enslave the entire planet and is evil in nature, a real threat to the hero and his goals under the right circumstances. He's manipulative and heartless, ruling his empire with an iron fist. And despite all that, he has an actual personality. Like, he really has character traits that are highly relatable to any audience that the show is aiming for. Not only was Aku fun to watch and had a creative concept to his design, but he was funny as hell. There was a unique sense of humor mixed in with his desire to troll Jack, and the ways he communicated with his subjects. He was clearly being a dick in a way that's very easy to understand. Aku was truly a villain who had a real sense of charisma and humanity mixed in with a thirst for power, rather than just being evil for the sake of being evil. And this opening sequence has a reasonable understanding of that, as we see how Aku is much more mundane and laxed, as opposed to presenting himself as an intimidating force of nature. The way he feels annoyed and restless as he starts his morning routine and punches his alarm clock to the side, and that uninterested look on his face that's just so funny to stare at, and even the way he communicates with these mud creatures like he's coming across as an aggravated maid who's trying to keep their house clean, are very humorous and charismatic ways to show that Aku has a real down-to-earth understanding of his environment and bounces off every mundane situation he's presented with in a way that feels human. It's not the best example of Aku when he's presenting himself as an everyman as opposed to an evil dictator, but it still has a good sense of pace and a grasp of what he can be like when he's not trying to hunt Jack or focus on his job as an overlord. The segment where he speaks to himself as a psychiatrist has a unique sense of sarcasm, expressing how he's practically lost interest in fighting Jack and wanting to kill him. It would make sense seeing as how it's been 50 years of just waiting for something to happen, and it also feels like nothing about this experience has enhanced due to Jack's inability to age, which has resulted in the hunt becoming dull to him. This scene takes a devoted amount of time expressing Aku's lost spark and how he just wants Jack to die already since this part of his life just doesn't motivate him anymore. He also restrains himself from saying his name as it most likely just reminds him of how strongly this sense of boredom has gotten to him. There's also a brief explanation as to why Jack doesn't age that I already had an idea of it being canon, how he's not affected by the laws of time since he himself is an abnormality towards this timeline. Granted, I'd like a further explanation for how that works, but the time travel was initially done with magic instead of science, so I suppose it doesn't require an explanation to make sense. And the scene concludes with him just blankly staring at the audience, which is a funny way for the show to present its sense of self-awareness. These facial expressions on Aku are entertainingly exaggerated as it fits with his design as a shapeshifter, giving them a wider range of possibilities. What follows is the show once again playing towards its greatest strength as it presents itself as a visual experience with hardly any dialogue for the rest of the episode. People have said that Samurai Jack is at its best when it uses the visuals and the music to tell its story, and I admire this episode strongly for being a shining example of that thesis. So much personality in this episode just comes from the way the characters travel, their facial expressions, the designs of the environments, the way Jack fights off the drones and the Seven Sisters, the sound effects, and especially the tone of the orchestra. And to get into the wider range of details, we need to start picking this episode piece by piece. This forest where the lone wolf walks around has such a poetic and three-dimensional feel to it, where we listen to these calm and relaxing sounds of chattering bugs, chirping birds, and the organic flow of the water. All of this mixed with these stunning visuals makes it feel like you really have been taken into a forest. Sunlight peeking through the trees, leaves brushing against the wind, and the shadow effects on the wolf as it travels across the forest. This scene is amazingly directed, and it has some kind of tie-in with Jack, as we know for certain that whatever happens to the wolf will relate to what Jack faces for the rest of the episode in some way. The fork in the road represents this sense of caution the two share, taking a moment to think before choosing their path, knowing that the wrong choice can lead to certain death. This leads to the wolf confronting these tiger, alligator, shark beasts in a pretty savage and primal way. There's no over-the-top flips and moves, it's literally a group of animals ripping each other apart. It's another example of this season keeping its word to have a much more serious tone, as you really feel the pain and the impact of each powerful bite, and the pools of blood that just flow across the screen. The portion with Jack has a much heavier emphasis on the environments. We see him slowly looking around him before making any sudden movements, as the screen shows several different shots of the forest. And unlike a certain movie that I'll be talking about down the line, this episode does a much better job of taking advantage of its blue color scheme. It looks like a very detailed painting in motion, with the background noises supporting its design. Highly fluid in its shadows and gritty dark layout. Jack then confronts the newest model of the Beto drone, pretty much one-hitting it with his spear throw. The destruction of this one is admittedly less creative, as we don't see any wires or bolts inside the machine as it's destroyed, which would have added more depth to the impact of the spear. The scene itself also feels completely pointless, considering how fast the drone is defeated. Like this new drone and those scientists in the opening scene could have easily been scrapped out, giving more focus to Jack's struggle with the Seven Sisters. Granted, when he does start fighting the sisters, it gets much more interesting. The way he looks around the forest after his motorcycle is destroyed by a wire shows how he's paying close detail to his environment and is going to plan out a strategy. His plans, however, are easily countered by the sisters as we see the full extent of their training, all of them completely overwhelming Jack, rendering his inventory useless and destroying his armor. The fight itself is captivating in its quick pace and emphasizing how great of a threat Jack is faced with, possibly the most dangerous he's ever been in since he lost his sword. He feels threatened to the point where he resorts to using his chain gun, and the pressure put on him makes him lose focus, giving the sisters an advantage. As he realizes he's become overwhelmed, he uses his explosives to escape, and hiding out while waiting for a clear getaway. Jack then has an argument with this other version of himself, and it's a very strong look into his psyche. This side of Jack focuses on the hopelessness of the situation, and how he would be doing himself a favor if he let himself die. This side of Jack symbolizing his fears of having lost to Aku, as demonstrated in last week's episode. He questions what is the point of going on. How can he if he's so tired, if he's so outmatched, if he doesn't have his blade? Why doesn't he just let himself die and free himself from this cycle of torment? But the true Jack motivates himself to keep going because he knows it would be a great dishonor to simply allow Aku to win. Jack has a great contrast with himself during this conversation, as he is now facing what might be his own self-worth, capturing a great yin-yang sense of hope and doubt. He knows he'll find a way, and he'll start by making a run for it in the rain. This scene uses its slow motion and cautious pace to its fullest potential, as Jack concentrates his senses to see what he's up against. He listens to the rain and the steps in the puddles of water to sense that he's fighting a group of 7 warriors, and the episode takes a break from the action to let you appreciate its artistry. The way the episode shifts from intense moments and more subdued segments like this is very well timed, and you never feel distracted from the plot but are still given something else to look forward to while the fight is being planned out. The music during these scenes also shines through with great presence and character. It understands that music must have a purpose in what's being presented on screen, and follows this rule to continue the episode's narrative just through the instrumentals. There's hardly any sound effects either. You just look at all of this stuff while listening to this music, and you have a perfect grasp of the tension that's going on. The sisters becoming slightly paranoid as they hunt Jack, but understanding the danger that Jack is in because he's so overwhelmed by these warriors. You feel the pressure that he's been put into, and how he really needs to get out of there before he gets killed. The cinematography is also excellent during the hunt in the temple. It takes advantage of the design of this worn-out and dissolved building to present the scene through inventive and unique shots, all of them having an interesting angle and variety to them. The color schemes in the temple are also very fluid, each one standing out in different areas and meshing together to make the setting and tone more vibrant. None of them are overshadowed or undermined. The blue shades and the green glows meld into the background greatly, which allow colors in the foreground to stand out nicely. The scene finally gets more action-oriented as we see the fighting and the tension building up with each turn that it takes, leading to a more interesting climax. We also get some references to previous episodes, like how Jack exercised to strengthen his legs, which he uses to boost him across the water, or how fighting blindfolded allows him to fight perfectly in the dark, even with his inventory diminished. It shows that despite all of these years, Jack is still making the most out of his training and not letting his combat skills dwindle, which is obviously how he survived for this long. The Chamber of the Fireflies has an amazing sense of build-up to it. The sisters begin to search for Jack as he's hiding in one of the many coffins in the room. Jack knows that he can't keep running and must hide. If he gets caught now, he's dead. The sisters are surrounding him, getting closer to his position, and the whole time, the music is building up, becoming more and more perilous as a dying light fades near Jack. When that light goes out, his time is up. The scene is also shot very well with an overview of the room, capturing a good scope of the area and how the sisters spread out to narrow their search formation. Finally, there's the climax that kick-starts with Jack timing his jump out of the coffin and grabbing a sword and nearby axe to fend himself off. The way he counters and dodges the sisters' techniques is fitting for him, relying on his quick wit and fast reflexes to keep up with all of them. He runs through a narrow hallway where he encounters one of the sisters and manages to kill her, though this one is not Ashi. Though triumphant with defeating one of them, Jack is wounded by a stab to the rib. Noticing the frequency dagger that was stolen, he taps it against the stone walls to cover his tracks from the remaining sisters and falls into a nearby river unconscious, severely bleeding out from his wounds. And then we see that the wolf died fighting off the beasts, and the contrast is that while Jack is able to survive, the wolf just died. But both of them put up a fierce fight, not giving their enemy the privilege of winning. The fight with the wolf and the beasts ended in a tie, and the fight with Jack and the sisters is still ongoing. I mean, they did show us 10 scenes that they haven't been in yet. Still, it's a pretty ominous cliffhanger, and it'll hold us over firmly until next week. One thing I just noticed about the episode before I started recording was how a key point of dialogue is ingeniously foreshadowed. Jack and his hallucination convince themselves that the 7 sisters are machines, not knowing that they're actually flesh and blood. And when Jack kills one of the sisters, Jack is taken by surprise and actually shocked about it. Everything up to this point, from the fact that nobody spoke to each other to the sisters covering their faces with masks, was meant to hide this twist for Jack, and it catches him off guard just as much as we were surprised to see someone's throat actually getting slit in this series. It's not like he hasn't killed anyone in the past, but he had a genuinely different idea of them before this happened. With this knowledge, his approach towards fighting them will vastly change. The question is, how will it change, and will he kill any more of them? While I can't say this episode is as dramatic or as cinematic as the previous one, Episode 2 of Season 5 of Samurai Jack was a very good follow-up. What I'm really liking about this season is how it's all becoming a connected story all the way through. Previous seasons certainly had continuity, but none of the episodes had a real connection into a full story. They just felt like weekly challenges Jack faced in his quest. If this is the final season, it really is best for them to make it much more story-based and focused on wrapping up Jack's story. Another thing I'm liking is how Jack's battle damage and loss of clothing is actually going to be carried out into next week. In the previous seasons, he just magically healed all his wounds and fixed his clothing with no sign of knitting or sewing. Not only is this a way of showing that this season is continuing to have a more consistent tone in its realism, but it's also creating some interesting stakes. With Jack having no way of instantly healing his wounds or getting back his equipment, how will he continue to fight off the Seven Sisters and any future enemies he comes across? He's practically left with nothing but the frequency blade and the dagger in his rib, and if he just pulls it out, he'll instantly bleed to death. Thanks again for watching a weekly review of my journey through Samurai Jack Season 5. If you're new here and you liked this video and are interested in future content, I recommend subscribing to my channel, and I also recommend you share this video on any website you choose to share it on, to share my content with friends and family you think would enjoy it as well. Until my next review, take care of yourselves and have a great day. MisAnthro Pony, over and out.
Watch out! Watch out!